Well, thank you so much, Linda, for being here today. I can't wait to get into our conversation, but let's start out with how you got into this unusual line of work, because when you first started your career, you didn't necessarily believe in reincarnation or past lives. Is that correct?
That is correct, Lisa. I mean, I thought I knew a whole lot. I was in my middle 40s when all this happened. That's about 26 or so years ago. But no, I mean, I certainly knew the term reincarnation, but if you said, do you believe in it back then, I would have said, I just am not sure. I just didn't have enough enough experiences basically to decide one way or the other. Yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about how you actually made that initial discovery?
Yes, it was a great surprise to me, and of course, now years later, I know it was all intended. So, the long story made short is in the spring of 1993, I had been a psychologist in general private practice, maybe 15 years. I had a colleague. We built a group practice together of psychologists and psychiatrists. This colleague was about 14 years younger than I, and he was in his early 30s. And very sadly, in 1993, he died from it. Back then, I would have used that just kind of flat sort of term. Back then, I would have said he died from a type of lung cancer. And when that happened, and of course it was sad, and I'd done a lot of death, dying, and grief counseling with clients. That was very familiar to me back then. But basically what happened was he started talking to me from the other side, which shocked me in the beginning. And he began to show me scenes of past lives that we had shared with each other. So I was kind of blown away. And then just another quick piece about it that I know was intended. So I asked my husband to sit down. He knew my colleague well. And I said, the classic thing you might say to your spouse or husband, I said, honey, I've got to tell you something that's going on. You're going to think this is crazy. My husband was a university professor at the time. And I told my husband what was going on for me, what my experiences were that I thought were just kind of eye-opening, really, and strange. And he just looked at me calmly, and I could tell he didn't think it was weird. And we'd never, ever spoken about reincarnation. Why? I don't know why we hadn't talked about it, but we had not. And basically, I told him what was going on, and he looked at me calmly, and I said, you don't think this is funny or odd or crazy, do you? And he said, no. I said, why not? He said, basically, I guess I repressed something that occurred for me when I was a boy growing up. He said around the age of 10, and only on that day in 1993 did he remember this. But he said, when I was maybe around 10, I remembered my past lives in detail, my husband said. And he said, but then I blocked it out because I didn't think anybody would believe me. So he said, go learn, go study. I'll support you. No problem. Go for it. I don't think you're crazy. That's what happened.
Wow. So when you say that your colleague was communicating with you, in what form were you doing meditations? How was the information coming through?
Yeah, good. I love that you're asking me that because, I'm sure listeners are wondering, how does intuition work and all of that? I would say it was a combination of feeling emotion as an intuitive connection, as well as, and this too is a common way of receiving intuitive information. It was just, you could call it clairaudient, you could call it claircognitive. It was like just these thoughts were coming to me, and I knew they were coming from him. It's that thing of when you know.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. And so then you started taking on clients, doing past life regression. How did you evolve into doing that?
Well, it took me a little while. I was totally fascinated, a little freaked out, and not, and I'll take the word little out, worried, not just a little bit, but a lot, that my whole psychology practice would dry up, because back then, most of my referrals in my conventional psychology practice came from medical doctors. So I was nervous, but I was so fascinated, I sort of, couldn't help myself. So I started reading everything I could put my hands on that I thought was grounded material. Then I trained in the first past life regression, and then later I trained in a longer type of regression called between lives regression. So I took training and then began to minimally guide a few clients at a time.
Okay. And now this is what you do. So now that we've laid some foundation, let's go ahead and talk about how learning about our past lives can actually help us solve issues that plague us no matter what we try, things that we just can't seem to solve with therapy or whatever it is, or even help to cure illnesses. Could you maybe share a story or two or how you've seen this actually work with your clients?
Yeah, sure. That's great as well. Well, let me just say, I'll start by saying for listeners that what I've learned over 26 years of guiding regression, and that's where I learned content. So I'm not plucking this information kind of out of the air. It comes from client after client after client. I've come to understand that as a soul, we grow, evolve, learn, gain wisdom by coming into body, by incarnating. And we basically we are required to go to school, you might say, school in body. And basically, two things happen when we incarnate. We have free will choice. When we're incarnating on Earth, we have complete free will. So even though we do come into body with a plan, with a life plan, we can go against that plan. So basically, two things happen. We either gather karma, which simply means, okay, I made a free will choice that wasn't necessarily the best choice in a past life, and in life today, I can balance that. And we gather dharma. Dharma means soul intention. It basically means, what did I accomplish in a past life? So when I guide a past life regression, a client will usually come in with some kind of question or issue, like you've mentioned, Lisa. Like the client might say, every winter I end up with strep throat twice a winter. Or for 6 years, I keep having these female issues. Or I've had this fear of getting on a ship or in a boat and going on the water. I have a fear of childbirth. I have, whatever. Past life regression can shed light on, why do I have this health issue that won't seem to shift? Why do I have this unexplained health issue that doctors say there's really nothing wrong, so and so there, you feel that pain in your chest that you've come to me, for 5 years about, but I find nothing wrong in your chest. Or I have this relationship issue with this person, or, I just met someone, but I just they bother me, or I'm uncomfortable with them, but I don't have any reason. That is almost always past life experience, or what we might call past life karma, that a past life can shed light on, and then we can reduce or fully get rid of the symptom.
Right, right. Yeah. I actually have an experience with that myself where I was having really horrible TMJ where it hurt really badly. I mean, I've always got the clicking, but it was a lot of pain. And I did a past life regression and discovered that in a past life, my husband and I were brothers, and it was hundreds of years ago. And he was very angry with me, and he picked up a sledgehammer and whacked me in this side of my face, and I actually ended up dying because he like tore my jaw off. So before this pain was occurring, he and I had just had a pretty big fight, and I was shutting my mouth. I wasn't going to say what I really needed to say. I was clenching my jaws and being, all right, I'm just going to shut up, and I'm just going to let him win this one, even though I really should have used my words. But because I was afraid of his anger from a past life occurrence, now I'm having this pain. And once I did the regression, the pain went away. And I've learned that I should just speak up, because he's not going to hit me with a sledgehammer this time around.
Yes, exactly. I mean, my quick story is I met my husband on a blind date, and he invited me on a second date about a week later. And midweek from Saturday to Saturday, from first date to second date, I woke up one morning with intense stomach pain. My parents took me, I was actually quite young. I was an older teenager. I was 17. And so my parents took me to the ER, and the doctor said, well, this could be appendicitis. We're not sure. Take her home, keep an eye on her. But if this gets worse, bring her right back because she's, it's probably appendicitis. Well, the pain went away by mid-afternoon. But many years later, I discovered that, about 2,500 years ago, I was betrothed, I was engaged to a man who is the soul of my current life husband. And he had kind of a prominent position of that day in that time period. And my aunt didn't want me to be able to marry into this prominent family. My husband was a military person in those days, and my aunt arranged for my husband to be killed by surprise by his own men, and he was stabbed in the part of his body where I was experiencing the abdominal pain because I was afraid. I didn't know, but oh, you better not continue dating this person because you'll just lose them. And so it's amazing how our bodies are, you might say, our soul cellular memory, just like you're describing, Lisa, holds on to that stuff, holds on to those fears until, I'm going to say, not necessarily until we understand it and can let it go, but that does tend to help to understand it.
Right, yeah. So another part of your work that I'm intrigued by all of it, but you say you drop these little nuggets in, and they just blow my mind. Let's talk about what happens between lives, because you do regressions to the between life state as well. So tell us about that.
Right. I call that between lives soul regression. A few of the listeners may know the original books that were written by Dr. Michael Newton, he was once my mentor many years ago. He's on the other side now. So between lives soul regression is a longer regression where I guide the client into relaxation. We go to a past life first. We move step by step or scene by scene through whatever past life the client's guides want them to discover. It's always a past life related to current life. And for everybody listening, a past life doesn't always hold trauma. It may hold accomplishment that we don't realize we've accomplished something in a past life. But in a between life soul regression, we move through the past life. We go all the way to the completion of the past life. We go to the death scene, as I would in just a past life regression. But then when the client, quote unquote, dies in the past life, we follow the soul's journey as it naturally occurs every time we die. That slice of soul that you might say resides within us that causes us to be alive, that slice of soul when we die, and in this case, when we die in the past life, has autopilot, you might say, and follows its natural journey, reconnecting with our soul self, our higher self. And then the remainder of the regression, you could say, is between lives, but an easier way of explaining it is the client is working with a guide, one or more, and they're working at their soul level to understand broad-based things about what is their soul's mission, who are the souls in their soul group, how did they plan their current life and why, and more and more.
Okay. Now, there was another one of those things you just dropped. Let's talk about soul groups. What are those exactly?
Okay. So, as a soul, we incarnate. It's almost like soul homeroom for people that are, old enough to know that term. As a soul, we belong from the beginning of our incarnational journey. We belong to a small group of souls that I like to call a soul family, a soul pod. It's about 10 to 20 souls, and we incarnate more often with those souls than any other souls. That's not to say that all those souls are in every life that we have. And it's not to say that we don't incarnate with other souls. For example, I have 2 adult children. One of them is a member of my soul pod. The other one, it's almost like, 2 soul pods sitting side by side. Our younger child is a member of what you might call the pod next door, or an adjacent pod that I have fewer lives with, but still repetitively have lives with that pod.
Okay. So this grouping of 20 to 30-ish souls, we all sort of just keep, it's like we get a different script every time, where this time I'm the mother and you're the daughter, and next time I'll be the father, and next time you'll be this, or maybe I'll be the cousin, or I'll be the warrior who kills you. So we're all, I'm the rapist, you're the assault victim. We all keep playing these roles.
Yes, and we keep trading places, like you say, and you've expanded it, so that's good. Some people start thinking, well, Linda's saying soul pod or soul family, so that means it's only my current life blood relatives, and it's not that. It could be blood relatives. Like, I mean, just as an example, I know a fair amount about my soul pod. In my soul pod does happen to be my spouse. Now, often, everybody listening, your romantic partner is not in your soul pod. So sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. But one of my husband's grandfathers and one of my grandfathers are in the pod. So you can see that it's not only not just bloodline, but it's also not your immediate bloodline. And it could be your favorite teacher from 3rd grade, or the first mentor you ever had in your field of study. But those are the souls that we incarnate with most often.
Okay. So when 2 separate soul pods sort of come together and intersect, what's the purpose beyond that? Is that just bringing in new blood, so it's not all inbreeding? What is the purpose for combining soul pods?
Well, one way of answering that, there's a whole variety of answers. So for everybody, and this is where I wish I had a chart and I was a great artist and I could draw all this on a chart so that you could show that on the screen. But think about like a stem of grapes. And one of the grapes on the stem is your soul pod. And then but it's a cluster of grapes. So there are many other grapes, or there are many other soul pods on that stem. So we have what you might call conglomerate soul groups. And conglomerate soul groups take on larger agreements. There are conglomerate soul groups that agree to bring a certain kind of learning to the earth. So you're really learning from each other. You're advancing each other's learning. But I think for people to not feel like it's quite so cut and dried, it isn't that, again, if you have 15 members of your soul pod, you don't, almost for sure, all 15 members, all 15 souls are not in your current life right now. It's not every single life. But add in one more quick piece here. In your, let's say there are 15 members, of that 15, there will be usually 1 or 2 of the 15 with whom you've incarnated most often. That is not your perfect romantic partner in life today, but that would be a soul that you really have worked with over and over and over, and you tend to agree to push each other's learning. Sometimes you may come into body with that other most familiar soul, and you don't get along. Your siblings that don't get along, your best friends that don't get along, because you've agreed to push each other's learning.
Okay. Well, then let's back up just a touch and go back into the between life stage, where we sort of have these meetings, I believe, where we agree to come into human form and play certain roles, and we arrange with people in our soul pods to play these roles. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I mean, stories, I always think that stories are the best way to explain things. So yes, so I'll use my own mother, who's now on the other side, as an example. So my mother passed about 5 years ago. To be honest, and I've said this, many people know this about Linda, I never had an easy, very cozy relationship with mom. She she just wasn't a terribly warm and nurturing kind of personality. People that knew her would agree with that. And I stuck with her. Now I always want to say, I know there are times when we just can't stick with someone that society says we should always have a relationship with. I don't believe in that. But I stuck it out, and I honestly am glad I stuck it out. But it was tough because mom would be very judgmental, and I could never do enough for my mother, blah 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 blah. When my mother Once my mother was widowed by my father, and then she started having health problems. She was much older. She was in her later 80s. I knew that I was going to be the child that would make sure she was cared for. I felt this just I would say to my husband, I'm going to make sure mom's cared for. But oh my gosh, can I deal with it? How will it be? And so once mom needed extra care and needed, to be in a kind of levels of care kind of facility, I was still there, and helping her out, even though it was not always easy. But long story short, over those period of latter years before she passed, we healed our relationship. And maybe 2 to 3 years before mom passed, I got in touch with a past life. And in that past life, the soul of my current life mother was my daughter. And I had married, her father was the love of my life. I had married him. My family didn't want me to marry this man. This man was quote unquote, a different religion. This man had strong political aspirations. I married him. We had a daughter. And then he walked out of the marriage because of his political desires and intentions. I basically willed myself to die when our daughter was 10 because I was so caught up in my grief over losing my husband. She'd already lost her father. I basically willed myself to die and abandoned her, which my guides, I strongly believe, viewed as karmic, not appropriate. And so the reason I was to stick with mom in life today was to balance that karma of not walking away from her even when the going was tough. And I'm so glad I did. And now I talk to mom on the other side a moderate amount. We're fine. She's fine. We have just a comfortable conversation, me to her on the other side.
Okay. So if you had not cleared this karma this time around before she passed, you would have had to do it the next time around, right?
I would just say I would have had to have cleaned it up at some point in time. Would it have to be the very next lifetime of my soul? Not necessarily, but ultimately it would kind of sit there in the karmic bank and need to be cleaned up.
Okay. Would it have had to been cleaned up with her soul specifically, or could you have just done a general, having a similar circumstance with another being?
I mean, you always have really good questions. That's a great question. And I think it varies situation to situation and soul to soul. My guess would be that, that would be a great question to ask a spiritual guide. I could ask my own, you could ask yours. I could guide a client to ask that question to their guide. I think that it would be cleaned up faster and more completely to clean it up with mom's soul. Right. I think I could have begun to clean it up with other souls, but more directly with her, I think would be much more effective.
Okay, but then in that case, you're sort of dependent on that soul playing along.
Right, and that, playing along, meaning, I think you're saying, agreeing to come into body and play that game.
Right.
Not a game. I don't mean it, in a flippant way. But yes, and that's all about life planning. That's the thing that, I always like to describe how we plan our lives a little bit almost like a movie. So imagine that before you incarnate, your guide comes to you and says, okay, Lisa, or okay, Linda, there's more wisdom that you need to gain. You're not finished with your incarnations. So let's have a meeting. Let's sit down. You might have more than one guide that comes together with your soul self, your higher self, and you begin to plan what you're going to work on. But yes, the other souls, my mother's soul obviously agreed to be my mother, I think for far more reason than just to clean up the karma that I've described. But yes, you have to have the agreement of all higher selves that are going to come into body with you.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for that. So now that we've covered past lives and everyone's sort of comfortable now with how normal the concept is, let's dive into a topic that you truly didn't expect to discover. The fact that some of us are Earth-based souls and others are interplanetary souls.
Okay, super.
All right. So tell us about how you were first introduced to the idea that we didn't all originate here on Earth, that some folks are Earth-based souls and some are interplanetary souls. And I believe you've discovered a third kind of soul.
Yes, and I talk about this all the time. It's the work that I do all the time. And yet, if I could, rewind the system and go back to 26 or 27 or 28 years ago, and you'd pose this kind of question to me, I would have gone, oh my gosh, that's really weird stuff. So it, of course, today is not weird stuff to me. Okay, so we'll start with the simple, and then we'll kind of build on it. When I was training, particularly in what I call between life soul regression, the past life and soul level regression, my mentor would say, sometimes we have past lives not on Earth. And he would say, there are people in body, there are souls in body, people on Earth that have had lives not on Earth. And so I accepted that was true. And I began then to guide between lives regression quite regularly. And after guiding it, 8 to 10 years or so, I started having more and more clients who were discovering past lives not on Earth. And as probably the listeners know, when I guide regression, I don't put ideas in the mind of the client. The client is, I guide it generically. I ask open-ended questions like, are you inside or outside? Is it day or night? Does this feel like Earth or not Earth? And when I train people in regression, it's like, don't load your voice either. So in other words, be open-ended when you ask these kinds of questions. About 8 to 10 years into my practice, so now it's maybe 14, 15 years ago, I started noticing that in my ongoing and very regular week in and week out, pretty much regression practice, that I had about 50% of my clients accessing past lives not on Earth. And they had a lot of detail. It was far too much detail to be, made up. And I began to learn and learn and learn about souls that, of course, are here now because they've been my clients, but souls that don't usually come to Earth. So just to make that simple, the terms I use are an Earth-based soul. And I'm not saying earthbound because sometimes people think I'm saying earthbound. That's a different term that people often connect with being like stuck, having died and being stuck. I don't mean that. So earth-based soul means you're a soul that for the last probably tens of thousands of years you've incarnated on Earth, or at least the bulk of your past lives are on this planet. Mm-hmm. Then there are interplanetary souls who are here now, but don't usually come to Earth. And the reason we have interplanetary souls on Earth is that, and I call them IP. IP souls come from healthy places in the universe. They come from healthy cultures somewhere in the universe, and they're bringing their wisdom here to try to help, I would say, get Earth unstuck or move humanity forward. So that's EB souls, Earth-based, IP souls, interplanetary. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, before we go into the third one that you've discovered, let's talk first about what are the differences between Earth-based and IP souls, and how can we tell where we each come from?
Yeah. Let me talk about, probably the easy way to answer that is I'll talk about the uniqueness of interplanetary souls. And this may, hopefully it will ring bells for some of you listening. If you're an interplanetary soul, and this isn't a list where you have to tick off all the boxes. I'm just going to give some examples. If you're an interplanetary soul, you may have spent many years being fascinated with the universe, fascinated with astrology, fascinated with sci-fi. I often have some of these interplanetary soul clients who will say, when I was a young child, I remember loving just standing by the window at night and staring out at the stars. And I just knew there was something really comfortable that I wanted to be up there, out in up in the sky, up in the stars. Also, interplanetary souls at times struggle. They're usually extremely wise, extremely gifted, sometimes very wise and gifted in like one aspect, like music or math or technology, or even something much more right-brained, like writing. Music, of course, would be right-brained. They're very gifted, and then sometimes they struggle with something that's opposite, like they do poorly with math, but they're very verbally gifted or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
They also at times have a fair number of physical health issues, dietary issues, autoimmune disorders, then the autistic spectrum. They also struggle sometimes with relationships and being out with a lot of people in the public. It's because their physical issues often are they're not used to working in the human body. They're not used to understanding how this human brain or human physiology functions. They can be ADD or ADHD, learning challenged, and yet again, they're extremely wise people. Yeah.
Okay. So then what about Earth-based souls? Well, how can you tell if you're an Earth-based soul?
Well, usually if you're an earth-based soul, you may have some issues like some dietary issues, but they're usually not extremely complicated. Earth-based souls tend to just function a bit more easily on Earth, even though, probably most people listening are very spiritual, and a lot of us, struggle with certain aspects of life on Earth. I happen to be an Earth-based soul. Relatively speaking, I'm fortunate. I have a pretty healthy, physical nature. I travel quite a bit. I cope with that fairly well. I understand human culture, human communication, and all of that. Yeah, as an earth-based soul, you just tend to function a bit more easily as a human.
Okay. All right. Well, you were actually talking a minute ago about interplanetary souls being particularly wise, but I'm also wondering about, how can I put this? Evolved souls, like a new soul on Earth, as opposed to an evolved, even an Earth-based soul. What are the big differences between, and we're not trying to make any judgment that, one isn't better or worse than the other.
Right. Well, that's tricky. So see how to kind of put some explanation out there. Sometimes people might think, okay, I'm always think about San Francisco. If anybody's been to downtown San Francisco around Union Square, there are a ton of homeless people. People whose lives are really complicated, or they might have, since I'm trained as a psychologist, I understand schizophrenia. Schizophrenics are not dangerous people. They just don't cope easily in normal society. So you might be in, kind of an urban setting and notice that. And if you're just kind of thinking off the cuff, you might say, oh, young soul in that homeless person's body, or young soul in that person who's kind of compromised and may be schizophrenic. No, maybe not. They may be very evolved souls, but they've come to be teachers. They've come to teach us compassion. They've come to teach us caring, that everybody doesn't have, an easy roof over their head and all of that. But a very young soul, especially not someone who's homeless or like this description I just gave, a very young soul is, it's kind of like, if anybody knows Maslow's hierarchy, if you think about the foundation of Maslow's hierarchy is, I just need my basic sustenance taken care of. I need basic lodging. I need basic food. I need clothing on my body. Young souls focus on really basic things. They may be those people, I don't know, I always hate to say, well, they're the person that washes their car every Saturday, or they're the person who's watching ball games 24/7. But, I don't want to say those things because that really kind of puts out judgment. But there are young souls on the planet, and we all had to go in terms of soul school from kindergarten to first grade to second grade to third grade. And, sometimes, Lisa, people will say to me, well, Linda, how many lives do you think I've had? Or, Linda, someone told me I had 1,036 lives. Isn't that cool? And I sometimes say back, well, what's cool is, are we accomplishing what we set out to accomplish in our life, relatively speaking? Because the number of lives we've had really doesn't matter. It's what we're doing to grow and evolve. So, yeah.
Well, now that you bring it up, how many lifetimes do we have?
Well, I think if you're meeting an experienced soul, if you're meeting an experienced, earth-based or interplanetary soul, you're probably talking to someone who's had hundreds, if not 1,000 or more lives.
Okay, all right. So now let's go ahead and let's talk about the third kind of soul that you've just recently started coming across, and tell us how that happened.
Yeah, and of course, it's partly what I love about my work is because I just learn, and then I learn more, and then I learn more from my clients. And I'm convinced that my guides, through client work, they're teaching me more and more. Excuse me, they're teaching me more and more and more, because they want me to work with other clients where I'm going to have more knowledge, a month from now, 6 months from now, to help other kinds of clients. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, my mind gets filled with all kinds of things. It's like, well, maybe I should share this piece and that piece.
So much to talk about.
So many topic pieces. I've come to understand the third category of souls, and again, separate from EBIP, is what I would call angelic realm souls. So if people just think about, there is a higher source of wisdom, knowledge, evolution. Doesn't matter what you call it. There are a zillion words you can use. I mean, sure, you can follow a conventional mode and say it's God. You could follow another mode and say it's Great Spirit, or the Source, or the Tao, or whatever you want to call it. There is a support system of souls that support the divine, and that is called the angelic realm. The angelic realm is headed by, as probably most people know, is coordinated by 4 souls, the 4 archangels. There are levels of angelic realm souls. Angelic realm souls, one of the characteristics or the characteristic is if you happen to, and this is hard to tweak apart for people, but if you know someone that is very, very pure in the love and compassion that they wish to see on our planet and that they wish to offer to others, it's just a deep purity of energy and how people and animals and the planet should be treated. They may well be an angelic realm soul. Now, my understanding is angelic realm or AR souls don't usually incarnate, period. They don't usually come into body, and when they do, or if they do, they generally come into body on Earth. I've learned of late from far more than one client that the higher realm, the guides, the master guides that serve in the higher realm, they are sufficiently concerned about humanity and humanity's progress that they're almost, you might say, experimenting. There are going to be more angelic realm souls coming to Earth to see if that can help us progress in this culture. So AR souls.
Okay, that's actually good news because things don't seem to be going very well now. So it's kind of nice to know that we do have a little backup. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that in general, because everything I've ever heard about the angelic realm is that they have not ever incarnated in a human form.
Right.
But that's changing. So when did this start happening? How old are the people that you're working with on average?
Um, on average, the angelic realm clients I've worked with are anywhere from their 40s to their 70s. Yeah.
Okay.
And so obviously, you know, these are people obviously that were born 40 to 70 years ago. And so it's my understanding now, here's a you know, we're stretching the listeners. Sometimes I get a question when I'm teaching about, Linda, is there such a thing as a walk-in? That's a spiritual term. You've probably heard that term. Is there such a thing as a walk-in? And for people that don't know what that term means, a walk-in means, and this is rare, a walk-in means that the original soul that, this is the way I like to explain it, the original soul that animated our body at birth leaves and a new soul takes over. Or let me say it differently, a different soul takes over. It's very rare that that happens. It often happens at a very specific time of trauma, and usually doesn't happen until we're well into our adult life. I've learned from more than one client that spirit is, as guides in the higher realm, are trying to assist humanity, that there may be more, not a lot for sure, but more walk-ins, and that the original animating soul of someone that wasn't angelic realm will be replaced by an angelic realm soul. And again, so everybody really grasps this piece, it's always by the agreement of both souls. It never happens without agreement.
Right, they're not kicked out and replaced. Well,
Right.
I'm so glad you brought this up because I wasn't going to ask you about it, but now that we're here, let's go.
Fine. Go
So,
for it.
how can a person tell if they're walking? Because I know of somebody in particular in my own personal life that I've already told them, you are a walk-in. So let's go ahead. How can you tell when is somebody a walk-in? And is this a pre-life agreement, or is this something that sort of happens while you're in the human form and you make the decision while you're already here?
Yeah, I'm almost positive it happens on the fly, you might say, that it's not a pre-birth agreement. I would just be almost 100% sure of that, given what I've learned from clients. And there are people that think they're walk-ins that at times I think they aren't, and sometimes we learn that through regression. But if someone out there listening thinks you're a walk-in, what you probably experienced is, let's just say, a week to a month of either illness, lack of energy, but pretty extreme lack of energy, some not just emotional shift, but physiological bridge, you might say, of shift. And that then in many ways you are very different. You may have energy you never had before. You may have somewhat different personality. I would hazard to say or to guess that if there's going to be a walk-in, it's not going to be so dramatic that you wouldn't, that the person is so totally different. There won't be anything quite that sort of, ground, earth shaking, earth shattering. But nonetheless, like someone I recently worked with who I'm fairly sure is a walk-in, for 2 to 3 weeks, she just thought she had a terrible case of the flu. She just didn't feel well. She didn't get better. Nothing shifted, no energy, and then suddenly she was fine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay. All right. And so there might be some subtle personality
yeah.
differences that
Yeah.
come.
And there might be things like preferences, changing the way you dress, changing the way you eat, completely changing, especially if you're a woman, your hairstyle or something like that, that something would probably be pretty obvious.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, I'm looking at the clock and we're not quite out of time yet, but we're getting there. So is there anything that we have not discussed that you feel bouncing around in your head, your guides are telling you, make sure you say this, or do you feel like we're complete?
Let me think for a second. Let's just kind of tune in and yeah, maybe this just kind of pops in my mind. Part of it's because I just came back from being part of a conference um, that was a teaching conference, and it was all focused on interplanetary souls, and it was very focused on, are there such things as interplanetary cultures, which of course I've already said, but there were a number of people who had experienced UFOs and that sort of thing. I have no doubt that spaceships are real. And I'm not talking about, because I think there's a lot of, I hate to put it this way, but fear mongering around this, like, oh, be careful, you might be damaged by someone coming from another planet. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do believe there are benevolent souls that both monitor us. Not only are some souls in body, interplanetary souls, but that we are monitored by other benevolent cultures. It's sort of like if we as humans think, we're sort of the only game in town, that Earth is the only game in town, that's just not true. So I think the bottom line is there's more expanding understanding and acceptance of many types of people, souls coming from other places. And I think, I would just add that what I think is crucial, I was actually saying this to a client just this morning, we need to be and do what we came to be and do. And even if you, meaning a listener, any listener, might think, well, what I'm interested in is weird, or I'm really afraid to out myself and, be real about who I am or what my gifts are, or what I want to do with my life, go for it. Because if we don't live our soul agreements, humanity isn't going to shift. And so let yourself be and do who you are.
All right, beautiful. I'm glad we went there. So before we go, I want to make sure that everyone knows how to get in touch with you. Your website, ravenheartcenter.com, and I'll put the link down below. That's where everyone can find out about your books. You've got numerous books about all of what we've discussed here, your courses, and people can even schedule a session with you, a past life regression or a between life session, and that can even be done over the phone, right?
That is correct. I guide past life regression by phone. That works fine. I only guide between life regression in person, but if people go to ravenheartcenter.com, I travel about 50% of the time. So I work in Colorado where I live, but I also travel about half the time. So people can just go check out my schedule.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wow. Linda, I'm so glad we had a chance to talk today. You always blow my mind. We could talk for days and days and days, but we're out of time. So thank you again, Linda Backman, for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been my pleasure.